Away this evening, we're going to catch up with Ian Love. He's a residents group spokesman. I'll tell you what happened. Over increased density in some of the developments. If you have a look at some of the planning, it's been frustrated for a number of years, and Ian is part of a group in the western suburbs who are saying, no, we don't like this. And it all comes as a result of the Civic Heart project in South Perth being approved by the Planning Minister Rita Saviotti using discretionary powers. I did make a comment on a social media page, which I'll explain shortly, that I thought this fight would really start to get interesting once it moved into the affluent western suburbs, where people have the financial ability to mount a challenge, and I guess also the staying power, because they can afford to have it, to continue to fight. Speaking of people who find themselves financially strapped, another business has been added to the list of those underpaying their staff. We're going to have a chat to Brooke Arnott from the Small Business Lounge. I wonder how you fare in small business. And what about if you're being paid? Do you actually know if you're being underpaid? Barry Eckhart's going to join us. We're going to have a look at 2020 being a difficult start, but what have we got now? The coronavirus and the bushfires? Are the emotional barriers to rebuilding tourism and other businesses unsurmountable? It's an interesting question. A bit later on this evening, Hilary Lane, our naturopath and pharmacist, will join us. Our regular contributor, Carolee Katzenbarnes, has written a book about being a step-parent. We'll have a chat to her about that tonight. Quiz after 11, Richard Arnold, you're on the phone too, I hope. 92211882 is our telephone number.
Until midnight, this is Perth Tonight with Chris Ilsley on 882 6PR.
On social media, I've been tied up with a group called Local Government Reform. I'm somebody who joined the group because I was interested in the whole discussion and things that centre around local government. And of course, something that pops up from time to time when talking about local government, proposed developments, density, all of that sort of stuff. And there was recently a comment on that page about the city of Swan and proposals to do with Henley Brook, which I commented on. I'll narrow this down because it applies to our next story. And I said, in part, I've mentioned elsewhere the McGowan government wants increased density based around its MetroNet proposals. The state is well aware of opposition to increased density in multiple potentially impacted communities and has sought to distance itself from the process whilst achieving its aims. It also works well for local councils. They can take one of two approaches, both of which serve to distance municipalities from and leave them untarnished by the ultimate outcome. What happens is the council either opposes, only to lose the inevitable appeal, or it approves and washes its hands by telling impacted residents there's little point spending ratepayers' funds fighting a proposal which will eventually get approved anyway. I guess the only option then is you go and mount a possibly expensive court challenge. Now, this is where it gets interesting. More people all over the metropolitan area will face this issue. Be interesting to see the outcome once the battle hits the affluent western suburbs containing white-collar professionals with the wherewithal to fight. And it would appear that is about to start happening. We've seen in a report on watoday.com.au by Marta Pascual-Wanota that protest groups across the city met in Nedlands last night, that being Tuesday night, in the hope that their combined influence would defend their communities from high-density developments. The spokesperson for the group is Ian Love, who joins us on the program right now. Hello, Ian.
Hello, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Am I having a conversation with somebody most would describe as a typical NIMBY?
Look, in fairness, probably started out like that. But what's kind of happened since then is we've seen across Perth and all of the same issues coming up again and again. So last night, we had 500 people at this meeting, and it was really pleasing to see. We had people from Iluka, which is a suburb north of June, beautiful brand new subdivision, really, or fairly new anyway, and down as far as Bunbury. Through the Perth Hills, South Perth, Daglish, Subiaco, Scarborough, throughout Perth.
So what you're saying is a spread of people from various different parts of the metropolitan area.
Totally. So we've totally, I think we've moved on from the NIMBY. I mean, it's a pretty blunt attack, to be honest, and I think I think we can move on from that.
Well, if we just accept for a moment that what we're doing is we're having a conversation with people who oppose density in their area, especially density as proposed, we're confronted with a really interesting issue, and that is, if you look at the MetroNet proposals, if you look at the way that many planners have advocated Perth needs to go, and once again I'll get back to two cities that are often mentioned, One is Toronto and the other is Amsterdam. These are cities that are contained within much, much, much smaller urban footprints than Perth, less than half the urban footprint of Perth. They have greater populations and much, much higher density, about 15 and 18 times respectively Perth's density of living. And it seems to me the one thing that hasn't been clearly articulated to the wider community, if we are going to emulate those the way planners say we should, if we're going to have lifestyles like those cities have, we are going to have to put far more in far less. And that seems to me to be the one area, Ian, where people haven't been, and when I say people, I'm talking about those within government and associated disciplines, haven't been honest with the public about that.
Well, I think, firstly, we're not against infill and development, so that's the first thing. But also, I don't know, you can cherry pick different cities around the world for good or bad examples of urban planning. I'm interested in what's happening in urban planning in Perth. Our population growth rate is 1.1%. And we, just for the city of Nedlands, for example, the new dwelling requirements that we were asked to meet under the Perth and Peel in 2050 were met. Our council passed an LPS 3, and that was going out for submission. But what's happened subsequent to that is we've seen the minister using her discretionary powers in a number of cases across the city to simply just impose her will without any sound justification. And, this is really quite concerning. But, I don't want to sort of really have this as a go as a minister because, and you touched on it earlier, for the last 2 decades, the democracy of planning and planning fundamentally should be about people. And we've seen that the democratic processes around planning slowly, by a death of 1,000 cuts, be whittled away.
But if you look at something, let's take, for example, if you don't mind, the Civic Heart project, which obviously is central to the issue at the moment relating to the minister stepping in and approving it. That had been on the boil for something like about 7 years. And it could be argued that local people jumping up and down about developments do so for so long that the net result is the people behind the project say this is too hard, too expensive, it's gone on too long, and they walk away. And the one thing that seems to have been clearly articulated is that we cannot continue to develop Perth like we did in the past. The people who seem to be most affected by the need to increase density are the people who seem to be most vehemently opposed to it. And at some point, we're actually going to have a frank conversation, because at the moment, if anybody in Perth tries to build a 4-storey building in their suburb, they will face a protest group and people will be running around with placards screaming high-rise. So how do we get this done without the process being frustrated and drawn out over a number of years to the extent that people involved just say, this is too hard, and walk away?
Well, actually, the reverse is the case. So actually, the developers don't think like that. They actually they say, let them cook for a while, right? And if you go around talking to people, and I've bumped into people who've been fighting these things for years, and in the end, they give up because it's an unfair fight. You've got mums and dads without planning skills, without cash, without access to lawyers, without access to planning people, because they're all conflicted because they can only work for the developers. Just to give you an idea, Chris, okay, the development near me is being done by an overseas corporation who's doing a $3.7 billion development in a city in China. Okay, but what interest do they have in developing a 7-storey building in Broadway? Well, anecdotally, and I haven't, this not for this particular case.
Well, they have a commercial interest. That would be it. I mean, they're in it to make money. That's the reality.
So they sell the units in China with a free holiday unit in Perth. The demand in Perth, 1.1% growth in Perth, does not justify the excessive zonings that we have right now. And essentially what's happened is the property developers over a period of decade have actually weaponised the planning system against the citizens. They've undermined our democracy, and we want our democracy back. We're calling on the CCC to look to see whether the minister has not acted impartially. Because in a number of cases that came up last night, time and time again, the speakers were saying, look, we don't have the evidence because we can't see the emails, we can't see what's happening, but the CCC can. And the last line of defence against an autocratic minister is the Triple C, and we're asking the Triple C to start an inquiry into the actions of the minister because we think she's acting autocratically and against the interest of the citizens of Western Australia.
Does she have the power to do so?
All ministers have what they call discretionary powers, but they're not unfettered. Because if discretionary powers can just be used at the whim of the minister, we'd be
they do it all the time. Absolutely.
But it's our job to stand up against it, Chris, because otherwise we live in an autocracy. As Western Australians, we value our democracy, and I think it's at least worth asking the question, as you just have, does the minister have the power just to do whatever she or he likes because the planning process is moving a little bit slow or the expert doesn't give the right report to her? No.
It seems to me to be interesting that you talked about planning proposals being needed and zonings being needed that you argue are not needed, but somehow they want these, and based on the growth numbers and what have you, saying, look, it can't be justified. Is part of the problem that we don't plan for the future?
We actually have planned for it. So the Perth and Peel report, for example, right, that was a 2050 report prepared for the plan for 2050 for Perth. And just to give you one example, and this is across the whole of Perth, but just to give you an example, Nedlands has roughly 8,000 current dwellings. Under the Perth and Peel report, the requirement was an additional 4,400 dwellings, which Nedlands Council planned for and met.
So it takes it to roughly 12,500 dwellings, yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so then the new imposed by the minister is 29,000 dwellings. So in what world does that make sense? And then they say, oh, no, don't worry about that. It's not going to be 29,000 dwellings because we estimate that only about 30% of the sites will be developed. What sort of planning school does that come from?
So let me get this right.
School of planning.
Let me get this right. You were told to plan for roughly 12,500 dwellings, which the council then did. You were then told it would have to be about 29,000, but you estimated only 30,000 of them would be used. 30% of that figure would be used. So you're planning.
No. The minister. Sorry. The WAPC at 30%.
No. I understand that. So what I'm saying is you're being told to plan for an eventuality. You're told in 70% of the cases won't happen.
Yeah.
How does that make sense?
How does that make sense?
That's doing my head in. I've got a headache already.
There's two. Look, trust me, Chris. I mean, honestly, we're all on a really steep learning curve here, and that was the other thing last night. We basically all these people that came together were showing solidarity to each other, and we're all educating each other. But there are two things. The other thing that came up, if I can touch on that, is the role of the Auditor General. Now, we've seen just at federal level how important the role of the Auditor General is in protecting our democracy. And the West Australian Auditor General can conduct what's called a performance audit. Now, the WAPC have never been subject to a performance audit. Nothing wrong with that necessarily, but they haven't been, just as a matter of, and although maybe they've been touched on, but the JDAP process, which is coming up to its 10-year anniversary next year, has never been subject to one. Now, you mentioned that in the headlines that, this planning system, I actually think...
Mate, the planning system is designed to achieve a desired outcome. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I kind of know what lies behind it all, but the thing for me that really sticks out is that you've got to win the hearts and minds of people, or at least take them along. If, for example, you're going to say to people in Nedlands, hey, you're going to have 30,000 dwellings. 500
people last night, whether their hearts and minds were won, and I can guarantee you to a person that none of them, absolute opposite. And
Ian, I realise that most people's hearts and minds with this haven't been won. What really bothers me more than anything is when I hear a lot of this talk around, especially from governments and planners, what I'm not hearing is a little bit of frank honesty, because my simple question is, okay, good, how is this to be achieved? And that's the one aspect that has never been clearly articulated. I get that the whole process is being frustrated, and you know something, I actually get that unless Perth continues to spread the way it always has, albeit at a smaller rate, the only way we can overcome that is to increase density. But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to win the hearts and minds of people along the way, or it's a process that's going to create a hell of a lot of resentment. It's going to be achieved, if at all, with much legal angst, Whereas at some point you say, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to achieve it, and go out and sell it. And listen, Ian, I'm prepared to accept that you may not be able to sell it, that they might be in the position where people say, you know something, we are not prepared to sacrifice the kind of lifestyle we've got in Perth to live, for example, like people do in highly dense European cities. And they'll have to accept that.
Look, I think you know, like, so just imagine the people in Iluka, right? So that's a northern suburb, a new suburb. They go out there and they...
Would you believe it's actually not that new anymore?
Yeah. And all of a sudden, next door to them is a 4-storey building looking directly into their pool. The type of things that are happening in terms of privacy is I hate to say this, but it's basically un-Australian. Nobody would accept it.
Yeah, and that is always going to be the problem. And if I can just interrupt there, if I can tell you about Iluka...
It's solvable. It's a solvable problem. And, you know, but there's no appetite to solve it. From what we're seeing coming out of the minister and the WAPC.
Can I just make an observation again? And I think this definitely applies to governments. We hear of plans, we hear of public consultation, all the rest of it. Now, maybe I'm a bit of a cynic and I'm prepared to wear that mantle if it fits. But when governments talk about consultation, that is purely window dressing for public relations. I always see it as we've decided what we're going to do, and somehow, even after the alleged public consultation process, we're still going to do what we want to do, and we're going to find some way to sell it. That's why we employ people to do that. And we say, most people are happy with this.
There, I agree with you. That's precisely what's happening. There's thousands of pages and people hours have been put into some public submissions, etc., and they end up in the round filing cabinet. As far as the public is concerned, there seems to be no look. I think we could solve this problem if you put people at the centre. I thought about the motivation of the minister, okay, and not just, to be fair, not just this minister, but all of the planning ministers that have come over the last 2 decades. And the motivation is more driven, and this has come from this minister, is about jobs. Now, there's nothing wrong with creating jobs. Creating jobs is great. But it's not the job of the planning department to create jobs. The job of the planning department is to have sensible, responsible planning that put people at the centre of the planning, not property developers and the profit of property developers.
Ian, we're out of time. Thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Ian Love, he's the spokesperson for the protest groups from across the city who met in Nedlands last night in the hope that their combined influence would defend their communities from high-density development. You can mark my words. Hold this one against me, if you will. Fasten your seatbelts. Because this is a bit like a game of hide and seek when we used to play it, count to 30. And then somebody would say, coming, ready or not. That is the case with this. For mine, I just think that the state government needs to be honest and say, this is what we want, this is how we intend to achieve it, and this is what's going to happen as part of that process. At least be honest. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you're necessarily going to like it, but it helps if people are honest.